Welcome to this week's episode of Sojourner, and don't forget to like and subscribe.
Welcome back to the ongoing series, How Spaces Define Masculinity, a Black and Black-Biracial Men's Initiative. My name is Carol Jean Matthews-Shifflett, and I am the CEO of the Sojourner Group. I'd like to start by thanking my sponsors, the Utah Jazz, Planned Parenthood Association of Utah, Pacific Island Knowledge to Action Resource, PCAR, the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault, UCASA, and Enlightened Productions. So today we are centering the voices of two men. Billy Palmer is the co-host, associate producer and director of civic engagement for Radioactive on KRCL in Salt Lake City, Utah. And then we have his formative years were spent here in Salt Lake, in Utah, which surprised me. I thought Billy was not from Utah. And then we have Chris Allen, who's the project manager of LG Harris Technologies. His formative years were spent in Knoxville, Tennessee. So I want to welcome both of you men, Mr. Palmer and Mr. Allen, to today's webinar. We're going to start by asking you a few questions. I'm going to let you introduce yourselves. So, and you can go in whichever order you would like to go in. But we'll start by asking the first question is who you are, where you grew up, the adults who were in your home, the ethnicity of your parents, if you were adopted, foster care, add that in as well. So who would like to start today?
You can go first, Billy.
Okay.
You're used to talking on the mic anyway, so you can go first.
It's true. I don't mind talking. I do it for a living. So, I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah for the most part, through most of my formative years, specifically the west side of Salt Lake. I'm a resident of Glendale, Salt Lake City, the neighborhood of Glendale in Salt Lake City. I bought a house for the most part where I grew up. We moved an awful lot. But I originally was born where my parents lived in Kearns, and my dad came this way into Salt Lake City from Moundville, Alabama, and Moundville, Alabama is down by Tuscaloosa. It's the start of the Black Belt County in Alabama, and so my dad came out of Alabama through Job Corps and got a job, joined a black church as soon as he could here. And he was a Baptist reverend most of his life. He aspired to get his own church one day and all of that. He died young. And my mother is white, and my grandmother came this way through Ohio. And so those roots I don't know as much about, but she came this way she had just lost her husband. I can't remember how he died, and she remarried in Salt Lake City by coming this way through Provo. She just took a shot. She went somewhere outside of Ohio. I got to go somewhere. I'm going to go. And so my mother raised me for the most part. My dad wasn't as involved with us. I grew up sometimes with my dad, sometimes not. So I grew up in Magna once my parents divorced when I was about 2 years old. Half of my grade school years I spent in Magna, and we were the only black family for a long time in the whole town. It was a much smaller town than it even is now. And then we moved to Salt Lake City because there were greener pastures and browner people as well here. So those were the adults in my home. It was mostly my mom, sometimes her mother, my grandmother. Quite often we lived with, we paired up with other people so that we could afford to live. I went to 14 grade schools by the time I got through grade school because we struggled on our own. We were kind of left behind financially by my dad, and so we struggled. We grew up, most of us cooking and in cleaning our own, the kids doing all that kind of work because my mother worked an awful lot. And then we didn't catch up on bills. We didn't make the rent sometimes. We got evicted, went to the next place. So that's a lot of my childhood. when we got old enough to work, we kind of stabilized more. We went to junior high. I went to one junior high, and I lived in two houses during my high school years. And so a lot more stabilization throughout all my adolescent years. But that was being poor and living black and brown in Utah. Um, I remember back then it was even difficult to get an apartment because there were little on the ads in the newspaper, there were LDS only, and that was kind of code for we don't need your kind here. So, but that's my growing up here.
14 elementary schools.
14. I sat down and counted them one time. I went to almost every school along the west side, a couple up over on the east side, one school in Magna, one school in West Valley. Yeah.
Boy, that's a lot. Look at you now.
Yeah.
Making noise on the radio in Salt Lake City, Utah, keeping us alive.
Right.
Okay, thank you. How about you, Mr. Allen?
So I was born in Knoxville, Tennessee, and pretty much was raised there my whole life. It was 6 of us as far as there's 3 boys, 3 girls. So I had 2 older brothers, then my 3 sisters, then I was the baby. And my mom and dad have been in my life the whole time, and we're all Black. He became a pastor of a church when I was in 6th grade, and he's been pastoring ever since. So that's been it's been a long time. It's probably over 40-something years that he's been pastoring. So and then after college, graduated from college in 97, and then I moved to Utah in 98. And then I've been in Utah for 22 years now.
Was that for employment?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. When I got out, got a job here, and my goal was to work 5 years, and I was getting out of Utah to just get some experience. And now it's 22 years later, I'm still here.
Seems like everybody says that. I'm getting out, and everybody comes back.
Yeah.
Billy may be able to explain that to us, but go ahead, Chris.
But so it was, like I said, and then my oldest brother, he passed away last year, and we were 13 years apart. So it's kind of, as far as like my 2, and then my other brother, there's some years between us. So it's kind of like growing up in the household, it was pretty much just me and I just kind of remember me and my 2 sisters, really, because the other 3 that was older than me, they was kind of, by the time I got to an age point, I mean, they were either out of the house or on their own. So it's kind of growing up in the house, it was just me and my 2 sisters.
Okay, all right. Yeah. Chris's parents are on the line. If you want to say hello and show your faces, you're more than welcome to do that. Don't let me make you shy. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. Boy, this is really interesting. I'm going to start with you, Chris. So you were raised in the home with your parents. Would you say that your father was the biggest influence on your masculinity, the idea of masculinity, or was there somebody in the family that influenced you on your masculinity and what it meant to be a Black man in America?
It was my father, and then I guess as far as he was the one that influenced me on a lot of things. And as far as being a Black man in America, to be honest, I never really thought about it and growing up, because in the neighborhood that we lived at growing up, it was pretty much an all Black neighborhood. Mm-hmm. I went to my middle school was mixed Black and white, and then my high school was an all Black high school. So it's kind of like we was in our own little world, I guess. So you really didn't see a lot of the stuff. And then when you did have the police that was in your neighborhood, it was kind of more like, I don't know, I can't really remember, but I don't know if it was like police brutality or if it was more of those was the ones that were selling drugs and doing stuff that they weren't supposed to be doing. So it's kind of like, well, we know the police is going to get them. If you're out on the corner at a certain time of the night, then you're out there, nothing is good. So the police is coming through. So if you're running because you don't want to get caught. So it wasn't like today, as we have a teenager, where they look in the world, and it's kind of like you scared of police. Because I wasn't really scared of the police growing up.
Okay.
It wasn't like today where today it's like a lot of kids are scared of the police and don't want this, but I never was really scared of the police.
Okay. All right. Okay. So your father. What
Yes.
about you, Billy? Especially being raised with a white mother and with your father not being around as much, who influenced your idea of masculinity in your home or in your family, should I say?
I'd say, um, I think I would say the brothers in my church, are they all knew my dad. They all kind of grew up with my dad a little bit. I mean, in a way, they were all getting jobs in Job Corps together when they were 16, 17 years old. And um, they, so, you know, they knew my family well. They cared about us. And I had two younger brothers. There's three boys and two older sisters. And to be honest with you, my mom tried to shape us in the idea of um, our community, which my community was mostly my black church. And then,
And that was here.
yeah, that was here. That was my anchor growing up,
Okay.
because we moved so often. I didn't have a lot of best friends for a long time, but
Right.
the kids in my churches are who I grew up with. And so I grew up mostly around black men. And I'd say that's what shaped my masculinity. A lot of it was, it's a very evangelical, very strict holiness church. And so there was a lot of how to be a man, how to take care of your woman, how to, how to be the head of the household, those types of things. And, in this changing world, it seems almost primitive. And I don't want to say primitive, but anachronistically, it doesn't fit anymore, some of those ideas of masculinity. But differently than Chris, I grew up afraid of the police,
Mhm.
absolutely afraid of the police. I the police in Magna growing up were scary, and the people in Magna were scary. It was a very rural and very white town, and there were times I think I had to fight constantly. And there's times we called the police, and the police would um, come and condemn us instead of the people that, I recall my sister getting beat up by two girls.
Mm.
Well, actually, she held her own. She did some work, uh, uh, and uh, she the police came and really talked down to my mother and threatened that the next time he had to come out, that we would be going to jail, that kind of thing. So Utah was very different in that way. And then in Salt Lake City, along the west side, there were very few police that were community police. It was very much um, like what we see in videos today. So I'm very familiar with police brutality. I got a few scars myself, that sort of thing. And being out any time of the night, coming home from work, walking home. I think I was pretty young, partly because of survival. I was pretty young when I had jobs. I think I first started working when I was 12. I had a newspaper
Mm.
route, and I've been working since. I used to lie about my age and get a job at McDonald's and things like that. And walking home from work, you get stopped all the time and say, "Why are you out? What are you doing?" And then handcuffed, pushed up against fences or cars or you name it, that sort of thing. And it's very unusual to find a police officer that was nice to you back then. So
What
I'd
age
say
were you when you left Magna?
we were. Let's see, I was about third grade. So what age is that? About 8 years old.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. So you left Magna, and you did see a little difference when you left Magna, I'm sure. Not a lot, because you were still in Utah,
yeah,
but
not a ton, but
yeah.
not a ton. But the police back in Magna were frightening. I mean, they were. There were a couple of incidences I won't mention here because of time, but yeah,
Mhm.
there were some scary, scary incidences that we had a Black family moved across from us. I lived in Section 8 housing, and so oddly enough, the two Black families that lived in Magna at the time, literally the whole town, we both lived just across from each other at some Section 8 housing, and their cousin came by, stole something from the 7-Eleven, and it did not go well for him. In fact, it scared the living daylights out of my mother for sure. So
Yeah, I'm sure. So before we move on, how did your mother feel about the men in the church teaching you, as you said, about, being Black in America, being Black in Utah? How did your
yeah,
mother
I think
support
that's an
that?
interesting question, because she's white and a woman, and it was it was almost a guessing game of how you raise Black children altogether, and then how you raise Black men. But she took a lot of coaching. She was told what to do, how to raise them, how to, she had a whole Black church to talk to us about what we do. And then she just mimicked everything else like we all do in our communities. We just do the things that are normal,
Uh-huh.
and the raising of our children, everybody's child is, I grew up saying yes sir, yes ma'am, and all of those things. And it was, when you were in church and you were talking to an elder, you might as well have been talking to your mom or your dad or a
Right,
grandparent.
right.
That's the kind of respect you had to have for people in my community. And so that was just seamless. You just knew better. You don't do that kind of thing, those types of things. So
So it sounds like your mother was pretty much in tune, being a white mother. She was not in denial of
right.
the differences of raising a Black child in America. She was very much,
No, she saw it firsthand from time to time, and I hate to say it, but my mother, living in an apartment complex, my mother saw a police officer hold a gun to my face.
mm,
So that was, there's no line between racially. When you're raising Black children, you gotta, in a sense, think Black. You gotta be Black. You gotta learn Black. You gotta just go along with what's in. I'm lucky, in a sense, more lucky than a lot of kids that grow up biracial or are adopted to white families, in the fact that I think when you have Black children, you need to get them around Black culture. You need
mhm.
to get them into understanding and being around people that look like them, have images up on the wall that look like you, listen to that music, experience your Blackness. I think that's important, to have that sense of culture within yourself, with those folks that identify with you. And I grew up with that, and a lot of people don't get to grow up with that. They grew up in a more of a white neighborhood and those types of things. But I grew up at least every Sunday, Wednesday, Friday. Well, Pentecostal, so we were churching every day. So I grew up with that strong root of, I had folks from Kentucky and Alabama and Mississippi and all sorts of folks that I grew up around. So I grew up with a lot of those roots in me. And I didn't realize that or recognize that until I got older, that there could have been a very different life for me being
Mhm.
biracial.
Yeah, sounds like it. And Chris, what denomination did you said your father's a pastor? What
Yeah,
denomination?
Church of God in Christ, so it's Pentecostal. So it's pretty
Oh,
much like
okay.
what Billy grew up in. And see, with
Okay.
me, as far as police, like police they never were in our neighborhood. And technically, I rather dealt with the police and deal with my mom. So so it's like if the police come first, I'm like happy, to be honest. It's like
So,
just don't tell moms, and then because mom was worse than the police.
as far as you knew, you didn't have too many encounters, so you don't know. Okay.
Stay tuned for the next episode on how spaces define masculinity, a Black and Black biracial men's initiative.